Back in 2015, when I started my journey as a developer, I do not care about how the services are provisioned, how my office connectivity has been set up to the Azure public cloud or portal.azure.com, how the different Azure services such as Key Vault web app is being provisioned in the project, how it's been provisioned, because my job is as a developer to bring the data, to read and write the data from one service to other, from UI to backend to the front end, things like that. But I did not have any idea about the networking concept. But as and when I started learning more about, and I'm willing to see myself as a technical architect in future, so that's where I think that I need to learn these concepts: public IP address, private IP address, virtualization, virtual network, whole set of things or terminologies which comes around the overall networking concept. And that's where I started learning the things from the networking area. And today I would like to share my experience and my understanding towards some of the networking concept in Azure, to start with Azure Virtual Network. So if you are like me when I was in 2015, you don't know anything about the networking concept, virtual network, things like virtual network, you are at the right place. Hi, my name is Rakesh Suryavanshi and we are going to discuss virtual network for the very first time with me in PLN. Let's begin. So Azure Virtual Network, first of all, is a service provided by Microsoft Azure, wherein you have the ability to design your own network, your own private network. Basically, think about a website such as in google.com, right? And let's say I have a website, a web application hosted here in Azure, and we have basically a website, let's say Google, hosted on Azure, and we know that a service hosted on the internet basically is accessible via some address such as in google.com, but behind the scene it is hosted on some IP address. So that IP address, if a website is accessible over the internet on a public network, it means the website is hosted on a public IP address. That's really simple and clear to everyone, I believe so. Now the concept of making these kind of a website comes into a private and secure in a scenario wherein I would like to create a website wherein I don't want the website to be accessible within certain boundaries. For example, let's say I have this website and I don't want to access this particular website from my network, let's say. So this is my company's network and this is my website. I would like to create this particular website or host this website within this boundary, and any user who is willing to access the website, they are supposed to access within this particular boundary, and I'm not allowing this website to be accessed out of this boundary. So how do I do that? Is basically you design your own network and then you define your services within that network boundary, and that's where the private network comes into a picture, right? Or in the legacy term, a LAN network comes into picture, which is managed by the organization specific network team. So similarly, in the cloud terminology, cloud offers you the similar concept of the private networking concept. So each cloud provider, they have their private networking concept. So in AWS it calls the VPC, virtual private network, and then here in the Azure it calls the virtual network, Azure Virtual Network. So wherein you can define a virtual network and then you host your different services in that particular virtual network, right? So I hope this is clear. So now you can have multiple services in this particular networks, so things like that. And so there are certain services which you would like to host over the internet. So what Azure does is Azure provides you an ability to attach a public IP address to your virtual network, wherein the attached IP address would be accessible via the or the internet. So let's say I have my internet user who is trying to access to one of the website which is hosted behind the scene here in the private network. So what I can do is I host this is just very high level we are discussing. So user is coming from the public network to trying to connect to this public IP address, and this public IP address is basically attached to this network, and this network has got a website hosted under this network, and which is going to be accessed by the user. Obviously there will be a more in-depth granular level detail comes into picture. For example, when you host a public IP address, you might be hosting it the public are exposing or connecting a public IP address in form of a public load balancer or application gateway or Azure front door, things like that. And how do you design your network security while exposing a public IP address on the public network? So things like that comes into picture, but this is how the high level networking concept works in Azure or anywhere in the cloud section. So now you have a whole set of network created, and you have the option to basically define your own services in this particular secure private boundary. Now one more thing you might be wondering, okay, that's fine, we can create your own public IP address, your own public services, but what about there are certain publicly available service which is a PaaS service, basically which is hosted or the available by Microsoft Azure itself. So what if we would like to create to connect, if we would like to connect those PaaS services to our internal services, to our private network services or services hosted within the private network? So Azure basically gives us an ability to basically design your network or to provide a connectivity between your network, wherein, let me show you, wherein it gives you the inner connectivity with the help of service endpoints. So service endpoint is a feature wherein you enable a service endpoint within your virtual network. So by enabling the service endpoint in a virtual network, the whole set of connectivity between the Azure hosted PaaS services and your private hosted services, the communication between these two services is allowed freely without having the expose of security. So your communication will not go via the internet, so it will go there will be an internal communication happens from your private network. So let's say this is your private network defined in Azure, and it works like that. So obviously any PaaS service which is hosted in Azure, which we are provisioning in Azure, obviously it is hosted under the Azure network, right? Though it is available publicly through some public IP address, but the security and the provisioning of those services is backed by some networking concept in Azure, right? So it is internally hosted somewhere in some virtual network, some physical network, and which and through which you are accessing using a public IP address. But when it comes to communication between these two services, and if you want to make it internal, then the service endpoint, which is a recent concept, not very recent, but recently, if a few years ago that was not the case, you used to connect like this particular end user is connecting. So like you were connecting via this route, but here now with the help of service endpoint you are connecting it directly from this particular area. I hope this makes sense. Now having this discussion in place, let's go back to the developer portal or the portal.azure.com, and then that's where we are going to create our very first virtual network and understand the concept practically. So in Azure, if I go to the Azure, you can search for virtual network, and then you can choose the virtual network services. So I can either create a new resource group. So let me create a new resource group, RG demo. So here I'm going to call demo VNET, and then you need to specify a region. So remember that in a virtual network you define when you choose a region, it means your virtual network will be deployed on a particular location in a given region which you choose, and you would not be able to make changes afterwards once it has been created networks. Now once you choose the location of or region of the network, next thing it asks you for the address space. This is just a CDRI notification or notations for the IP address range. If you would like, you can choose a different IP address range for your network. For example, if I go and choose to the CDRI notation for 24, then this is what the IP address I can choose. So based on the CDRI notation I specify for my IP address range, I would have the number of IP addresses available for that particular locations. So there is a subnetting and the IP address CDRI IP address range table available. So when I say choose the /24, it means I am trying to specify the class B IP addresses or class C IP addresses, IP ranges. So and that's the reason I was able to see the number of IP addresses in 256. So if you would like to specify or you would like to go to class C IP address range, which is starts with /16, then you would have more number of IP address range, which you can see from this particular table. This is the table which I often use when I design my network, and this gives me an idea how many number of subnet range would be available if I go for IP address class C or class B. Let's say if I go to class B, then I would have these many number of IP address, which is this, and I may be able to define the number of subnets, which is this. I can define these many number of subnets in that particular IP in that particular class range, right? So once you define the IP address range, you can define the subnets, number of subnet which you would like to have it within your network. So for example, I can create a subnet or I can modify the subnet range, something like that. So if I create a subnet, then this is my only subnet which is available. But let's say if I go and select for 17, then these will be the number of IP address which will be available. So you can take a look at this particular subnetting. So this will be the total number of subnet which will be available. If I say /16, so basically I'm dividing the subnet. So if I go to the subnet, then I will have the total number of 4 subnets available. So at max I can create 4 number of subnets. And if I say /19, so for example, if you would like to define let's say if you want to have from this /16 IP address, if you want to have 17 subnets, then you can go to /21, because from this /21 you can create maximum up to 32 subnets. So once you put /17 21, you can say, okay, this is my one subnet, this is my another 2 subnets, something like that, and then you can put your IP addresses over there. Okay, so this is how you define the subnets block. and I can have one or more subnets. For example, 1.0.0, 1.0.8.0./21, something like that, and then /8, 9, 10, some subnet 2. And once I create a network, the network will be available for me. So once you create the network, you would see that the virtual network would have the location as we have selected. Then you also will see the address range which we have specified. So later at some point of time, if you would like to have a change of mind, or if you have a requirement wherein you want to attach any additional address space range, then you can go ahead and attach that particular address space range at any given point of time. Okay, now next thing is about the subnets. You can see that the subnet range which we have selected, and we have found that these are the subnet available. Now you might be wondering, in my subnet table, I can see that when I say /21, I can see the total number of host IP address is available as a 2048, but whereas here it is showing only 2043. So why it is so? The reason for that is Azure reserves 5 IP address from your subnet. So any subnet which you create, from that particular subnet, 5 different subnet IP address are going to be reserved by Azure. And what are those 5 IP address? One is, the very first IP address is your network IP address. The next IP address is reserved by Azure for the default gateway, on which you can host the default gateway. Now next two IP address is reserved by Azure to map the DNS IP to the VNET space. And the last IP address is reserved by, not by Azure, but it is reserved by the default reserved for the default network broadcast IP address. So these are the 5 IP addresses which you cannot use from the subnet. So make sure when you are specifying the IP address or defining your subnet, then you need to remember that the whatever number of subnet I am choosing, from there that particular those 5 IP address will not be available. And that's the reason, if you check that here it is showing 248 2048, but here it is just 2043. That's the reason, right? Next thing to remember on the when you are choosing a subnet, you need to define, or you need to apply a logic while choosing the subnet range, by making a decision that which type of service you are going to deploy on that subnet. For example, there are certain Azure services which requires the dedicated subnet. For example, in API management, services called API management, that API management service itself requires the dedicated subnet. So I can't host any other services apart from API management in that subnet. So I may want to create a subnet with the smaller range of IP address for that subnet, because API management will require only one IP address at max. At least for that specific range, I don't want to allocate the entire subnet which is of 2000 IP addresses available. Now the second case is, let's say if you would like to host services like VM skill set, or let's say Azure Kubernetes, or you would have the option to scale up your services, horizontal scaling. So like in a case Azure Kubernetes, when you host the Kubernetes on a particular subnet, it deploys number of nodes, and within the node it deploys the number of pods. So you need to remember that what is my requirement, how many pods I will be required in the worst case scenario. So in the best case scenario, let's say I may want to start with one node with 110 pods, so which is my subnet will have a requirement of 110 IP address, because of one node plus each pod will require one set of IP address. So if there will be 110 pods, I will have a requirement of 110 IP addresses. But let's say in future, if your application is not performing well and you would like to go for a scale up option, or if you want to scale out your number of nodes from 1 to 3, then in that case increasing 2 more additional nodes, it means you will require to increase, or you will have a requirement of another 222 nodes, 22 IP addresses in that case. So you need to apply a thought process while choosing a subnet range, so that you are not going to be in trouble in future. So if you are designing your solution for any customer for your project, then you need to make sure how do you are dividing your network boundaries for your project. So that's really helpful to understand when you define a network. In services like AKS or any services which provides the horizontal scaling and it consumes the number of IP address while performing the scalability, then I would recommend you to choose a wider range of IP address for that particular specific subnet. Okay, now moving from here to the concept wherein recently in Azure your virtual network is protected by the DDoS protection level. By default this service is disabled, but now Azure is recommending you to enable the DDoS protection, so that any kind of a DDoS attack happening on your virtual network, it is going to be protected with those kind of vulnerabilities. So it is highly recommended to protect your virtual network with the DDoS protection. On top of that, you can have the virtual network firewall enable on your virtual network. So there is a separate service called the Azure firewall, which we can link to your virtual network and then apply the firewall rules, which can be allow certain services or certain endpoints to exist, and which can be block certain IP address if you would like to, basically. Now one thing to remember here is about the virtual private network. First, as I said, virtual network is limited to single region. It doesn't mean that you would not be able to connect to the secondary region. What it means is, if you would like to connect to another virtual network which is in the different region, you would require to use the global VNET peering. So VNET to VNET peering, I'll show you where exactly the option is available. Now the second thing is, when you create and design the virtual network, by default within the virtual network, outbound connection from your network to the internet is open. It means any services which you are provisioning in your virtual network, let's say if I am creating a virtual machine in my virtual network, then from that virtual machine I would be able to access the internet. For example, if I open a browser from that virtual machine and browse google.com, I would be able to access the internet or any website from there. So if you want to design a solution wherein your customer have a specific requirement and they would like to restrict the internet access, then you may want to use the services like network security group. So network security group is a service which you can use, and you can specify inbound and outbound rules to basically allow and disallow certain communication or certain points to disable. For example, if I don't want to allow the internet connection to open, then I can have an outbound rule wherein I can specify block the internet connection, things like that. We'll discuss sometime later about the NSG rules. Now coming back to the portal, here in the DNS server, currently by default when you create the Azure virtual network, basically your network is designed or default DNS server in the network is Azure provided DNS server. What does it mean is your virtual network would be able to communicate to any services available in Azure in all the region. Basically, obviously not a private cloud region like cloud in China, but any public cloud or Azure cloud region, any services hosted out there, your virtual network would be able to communicate with the help of the default DNS server. Define a custom DNS zone for your virtual network, then you can specify the custom DNS zone IP address for your virtual network from this particular radio button, and then your virtual network would be part of your own DNS server. So you can specify your DNS server entry from here. Now I was saying earlier in the discussion about the VNET pairing. Let's say in our example, let's say I have two different virtual network. One is the network which is acting as a hub network and which will have certain services hosted which would be exposed over the internet. For example, I have a website hosted on my hub network which is exposed to the public internet, and then I have certain spoke network which are basically kind of a private network, and in that case I would like to connect my hub with spoke so that anyone who is coming from the internet, they will come from the hub, and then my communication will route from the hub to the spoke from VNet to VNet communication. And how it will happen is it will happen through the peering between those hub and spoke networks. So with the help of this peering option, you can create the VNet peering, and then you can attach one VNet to the other VNet with the help of this peering option, which you can specify from here. Okay, so this is the reason this peering option is available. Now next one is about the service endpoint. At the beginning I have mentioned that we can specify the service endpoint, wherein if we would like to manage our virtual network services, communication of our services hosted in virtual network with the services available in Azure PaaS, such as in storage account, and I would like to make the communication possibly internal, which is more secure, and a direct communication between Azure and my own private network, then this is the endpoint, service endpoint I would like to expose for this particular service. So for example, I would say I would like to connect to the storage account from here, and then I'll specify the different policies, and then I can say this is my subnet, or the services hosted under this subnet would be able to communicate to this particular storage account services with the help of this service endpoints. So this is how I can specify the boundaries. Now the one more latest thing which is available is the private endpoint. So this is a concept. Basically at the high level, it allows you to give a direct connectivity from your virtual network to the services available in Azure PaaS. For example, I would like to communicate directly to the storage account. So obviously by default the storage account hosted on a publicly service, and that's the reason we are calling it as a PaaS service. But if I want to make that PaaS service as a private service, and I would like to be part of that service, I would like to include it in my virtual private network, then with the help of private endpoint I can attach that storage account service to my private network, and then there will be a dedicated private IP address attached to the storage account, so that anybody who is willing to connect to a storage account, they would require to come via my private IP address route, so they won't be able to connect to the default publicly available storage account URL. They need to come via my network communication, and they need to follow all my guidelines, which I have specified in my virtual network, right? So this is how the private network concept at the high level is been given, and this is how you can specify. Now at the last, if we are going to cover about the defining the storage account with the help of Terraform. So let's quickly go to the Terraform module. So if I go to the search for Terraform, and here is the documentation available for virtual network as a service, and you can see that you can copy the documentation available. So this is the resource type which is available for virtual network. I have my Terraform project as a repository I'm going to share with you here in this particular video. So here in this repository I have a network module, and here in the network module I am going to create a main.tf file, and I'll just paste this particular module. For now, let's say I have used the same services as is, so let's use the DDoS protection as well. For example, we would like to create a DDoS protection as well as part of this particular network. So let's say these are the services we would like to call location, and resource group name is something which we are going to pass as a parameter for my virtual network. Sorry about that. Virtual network resource group name. So this is what these two things I would like to include it in the variable section. Now let's go to the variable section. Location name, VNET name, we are going to use that as well. So let's see. So these are the things which I have included, and here are some subnet range. So again, you can specify through the dynamic loop. Let's leave this as is. We would modify this later. First of all, let's make sure we are able to call this module from here. So here I have the network module created, and from the resource group I'm passing the resource group name, and from the virtual network name I'm using the one of the prefix is basically the name of the resource group, and then I'll add the VNET as an prefix on that. Okay, so let's see if I'm going to run my Terraform plan. So let's initiate my Terraform quickly. So I'm running the Terraform here on my main folder, main project, and I'm first of all initializing it. So my initialization of my Terraform module is successfully completed. Now let's see how we would like to proceed ahead. So I'm passing the JSON file for my Terraform work. Let's see if it is going to work. So at the moment I got an error. So it says network security group is not working. Let's see if we are using any network security groups. I might have made a mistake. So here they are using any network security group. For if you would have a requirement, you can use it, but for now we are going to skip the security group. So I don't want any network security group. So what exactly they were doing is, in the example from the Terraform documentation, they have created one virtual network, and the virtual network is having the connection of configured with the DDoS protection, and then within the virtual network you have the option to create multiple subnets. So they are creating subnet 1, subnet 2, subnet 3, and the subnet 3 was basically they are marking with some network security group, which obviously you need to create a sub network security group as a resource, and then that resource ID you need to attach to a subnet. So as we did not copy the network security group resource, that's the reason it was failing. So now you can see that the plan is successfully run, and now if I review the plan, it is going to create my resource group, it will create a DDoS protection for me, and it will create a resource group as well, network, virtual network as well. So obviously the virtual network IP address, we have used the same IP address as we have created in our manual demonstration from the portal. So these IP address are going to be clashed, so which is not a good idea. You need to make sure that within the subscription you are not clashing these IP address range. Okay, so now if I'm going to apply the terraform plan, then I should be able to create the virtual network very quickly. Let's see if it works. And once it is going to work successfully, we would have the successful demonstration of how do you create a virtual network with the help of terraform as well. Now there would be a scope of making it more robust. For example, we don't want to hard code these subnet names, we don't want to hard code, we would like to create make it flexible, so that based on the input we would like to make how many number of subnet we would like to create. So kind of a dynamic logic we would like to apply. So we'll see that. Now let's verify. It seems like our deployment is completed, you can see that. Let's verify the deployment. So if I go back to the resource groups, let's see. First of all, our resource group is created. Here is the resource group, here is the DDoS protection plan, and here is our virtual network prefix with VNET, and then the name of your basically resource group name suffix. And you can see that we have got the tags, we have got the address space range, we have got the subnet as well. All three subnets are available. And if we would have created a security group, then the security group has also been connected. So this is how it's really easy to terraform a virtual network group. Now you can basically, obviously I can change it. Let's say I can call it web subnet, service subnet, and I can call it a data subnet. So if I am going to rerun the plan, then it will rename the changes. The deployment is completed. Let's verify the change one more time. Let's see if the subnet names are created, and you can see that the subnet name has changed now, and now we have got the appropriate subnet name: web subnet, service subnet, and data subnet, which makes more sense. This is how you define your own subnet, and then once I can go ahead and then allocate a subnet. Now one thing I would like to tell you about the virtual network: when you create a service or create a service within the virtual network, then a virtual network will allocate the IP address. By default, when a service is created within the virtual network, the IP address allocation method remains dynamic. What dynamic means is, when that particular service is going to be deallocated or stopped, then in that case your IP address is going to be deallocated. And next time when let's say at the same time, if some other services are going to be provisioned, at that point of time the IP address will be it might possible that the IP address will be allocated to the other services. For an example, let's say I have created a virtual machine and the dynamic IP address is allocated to that virtual machine. Now if the virtual machine has been deallocated, then automatically, if next time I'm going to create any other services, let's say internal load balancer or any other virtual machine, if I'm going to create within the same subnet, then the same IP address will be allocated to there as to that new service as well, right? So if you would have to have a requirement of making the IP address constant, then make sure you are making the selection of the IP address as in public, as in a static IP address instead of the dynamic IP address. So when you choose the IP address or you choose a service from the, let's say if I'm going to create a virtual machine and specifying the subnet type, in that subnet, for example in the web subnet I would like to create a virtual machine, then I should specify that from the web subnet I would like to choose this particular IP address as in static, so that IP address will become the static IP address and it will be allocated to that virtual machine for that period of time. Okay, that was about the overall concept of the virtual network, subnet, and the networking concept, a little bit about the networking concept. I hope this was helpful and going to help you to understand the journey of designing your own network and the networking services for your project. Thanks for watching the video. If you like it, please give it a thumbs up and share with your friends. See you in the next video.